governments around the world have been increasingly sensitised to the issues around housing affordability and market booms, where prior to that, governments saw housing booms as probably counter-cyclical and an opportunity to address problems in the business cycle. But after 2008, things began to say, okay, housing markets can really cause problems. So housing affordability has assumed significance both for central and local government, and it's particularly the case in New Zealand. And what I want to do is look at a lens to explore what's been happening by looking at two pieces of legislation. One is the Housing Accords and Special Housing Areas Act, and the second is the Social Housing Reform Act, both introduced into 2013. What I want to do is to review the origins and impacts of this legislation, firstly looking at housing affordability and debates around housing affordability, and then looking at, secondly, about social housing reforms. There is a connection, and hopefully I'll make those connections by the time we get to the end of this presentation. So looking firstly at housing affordability and supply issues, this part of my talk comes from a paper that I've just been published in Urban Studies. It looks at the politics of housing affordability in New Zealand, and in there I trace the evolving construction of housing affordability. Basically, there's an argument in New Zealand we need better evidence-based policy, and the local government have produced their evidence, and central government has produced its evidence, and they don't necessarily match, but they both produce evidence, and it's international evidence, and it's supported by a huge amount of research, and so there's a huge debate. And I've looked at that ongoing conflict, but I'm not going to spend time looking at the nature of that conflict. I'm just going to go through the empirical material, what's happened over the last few years, the policy development that has occurred. So if we look at New Zealand, the National Party elected in 2008, Conservative Party with strong links to kind of neoliberal policies supporting the market and market provision over state provision. In 2010, it repealed the Affordable Housing Enabling Territorial Authorities Act that had just been introduced in 2008, which was the New Zealand's first attempt at something akin to inclusionary housing. Never really took off, and National closed it down. In 2011, it established the New Zealand Productivity Commission inquiry into housing affordability, and this is the front page of the Housing Affordability Report. And the Productivity Commission, independent, strongly looked at both demand and supply drivers of housing affordability, but probably focus primarily on the supply issues. In terms of the summary of findings, with very significant implication for policy going forward, this report, which basically, you can see that blue line is nominal house prices from 1992 to 2010 in New Zealand, and basically it's up and away house prices. And it looked at that, and it argued that what was driving it, in the summary of its findings, having looked at all issues, it came out and said urban planning, infrastructure costs, building costs, up at the top were the key drivers. And so the government interpreted that as planning restrictions equals housing costs. If we want more affordability, we need to address the planning system at the local authority level. In terms of the actual report itself, the urban planning, the report argued that urban planning is a significant problem, and that there is an urgent need to increase land availability to ease supply constraints, and this is particularly an issue within Auckland. Auckland's the largest metropolitan area, 1/3 of the population, rapid house price inflation over the last 15 years. And they said what's driving this is a planning regime that is focused on containment, on smart city growth, on compact city. And so this red line around Auckland is kind of the extent of the metropolitan urban limit that has been in effect for 20 years. Now in 2010, the central government amalgamated all of the authorities in Auckland 7 of those authorities, turned them into a super city and told them to create a new planning agenda. And here it was, a policy coming out saying one of your big problems is that you're constraining the growth of that city. So Auckland Council responded and they produced a plan in 2012, and it had a housing affordability component to it. So local government is responding and saying we're going to address those issues. It moved away from a metropolitan urban limit and created what was called a rural urban boundary, or the RUB, much more fluid, letting you develop on the periphery up to 40%. But also strategically, it continued to push for this notion of inclusionary zoning. So it included in the unitary plan this idea that there would be retained affordable housing required from developers. And the notion of retained was totally new. It had never been encountered by central government before. And so in the planning document that was being produced at local level is this notion of retained affordable housing. So we had this proposed plan. It would take 3 years to come into effect, so the government said that's not fast enough, so it introduced a housing accord. The housing accord was a relationship between central government and local government, in this case Auckland Council, identifying fast track areas where you produce more housing rapidly, getting away from the old planning system, much faster production, the aim of producing 39,000 houses. In order to do this, they had to introduce new legislation. The legislation had a kind of set out the structure. If the minister believed there was a housing issue, he would go in to discuss with the council and say, right, we're going to do something about this. If the council agreed with them, then they would have an accord. If they didn't agree, then the council would set up a central government to produce housing, take over the planning of that area. Then finally the consents would be looked at either by the council or by the Minister for Business and Innovation. So where was this coming from? It was coming from central government. I probably can't read this, I'm sorry. I thought you'd be nearer. But basically the Minister for Finance, who's also a Minister for Housing, he argued that what drives up house prices are planning laws. These are explicitly designed to drive up housing values. So the Minister for Finance said what it causes house price increase is simply planning. That's it. And consequently, they were going to deal with it and said this accord is trying to force those to release land. If they don't release land, we'll do it. So when the bill came into its third reading, another Minister for Housing, we've got 3, remember, second Minister for Housing, introduced the bill, and he introduced it with these amazing words, and I hope some of you can read these words. I'll read it to you. We've got a constipated planning system, bogging new residential construction, and this bill is a laxative to get new houses flowing. There's a real kind of plumbing kind of approach to the development. This is boots on the ground, getting it developed. And the minister said the government's strong preference is to get this work done in partnership with councils through housing accords, but also provides the government can get on with the job if the councils stand in the way. So it's a kind of cooperation, but also coercion. So I'm going to just rapidly go through some issues. But basically the Act came into power. Its main part of the Act is that we provide for affordable housing. And how do you do that? It's simply provide more land. If we provide more land, then you'll have more affordable housing. Within the legislation, there was also a provision that you may, there's a word there, may provide a direct requirement to provide affordable housing to developers based on some measure of affordability in the preceding year. So what happened is the council then went out and allowed developers to seek to build housing in areas designated as a special housing area, and then the council really wanted to have affordable housing, so it tried to push hard for a requirement for some form of inclusionary zoning. So they pushed that maybe 10% of housing would be affordable, and that affordable is some measure of 75% of the median house price for the area. So if we look at what happens, that raises issues, is that affordable, and what are you actually buying? So in New Zealand, at Auckland, over the last 12 years, house prices have gone up. The large line in the diagram's gone up. And on the right-hand side, the red line is that affordability measure. So in the 3 years that it's been operating, the affordability measure for entry level has gone up from over 386,000 to 578,000. So that's a 50% increase in that affordability measure. So if I'm a developer and I get these special permission to build that fast tracks, gets rid of all of the requirements of consenting and having to talk to other people, and I get this opportunity to provide housing, I just have to provide 10% that would hit that target. And if I'm slow enough to produce it, if I produce it slowly, that will go up again in the next year. So if it's gone up 50% in the 3 years that it's operating. And then what I have to do is, if I'm providing 4-bedroom houses, I'll just put in a couple of 1-bedroom houses and I'll hit the target. But the question is that affordable? So what's been happening in the Auckland area? This is a big drive by the government, these special housing areas. 154 special housing areas have been declared, potential provision of 56,000 houses in the Auckland region alone. So they're both brownfield sites and greenfield sites. Again, I'm sorry, there is this table, just every development that has occurred outside the existing metropolitan urban zone is just marked, and there's one of the columns says out, so it's outside of the metropolitan urban limit. And basically 16 of these special housing areas are outside of the old metropolitan urban limit. Over 29,000 houses are being put in these areas, or over 50% of all these special housing. So this was the government's, we want supply, we want it on the periphery, and this is what we're getting. So they've really pushed this, and it's had significant implications for how the city, or the metropolitan area, is growing and how it's going to address issues going forward. In terms of the consenting process, we've got 56,000 consented. In terms of what's being built over the 3 years, we've got 1,000 houses. So 1,000 houses in 1,000 days, I think. I picked that up from this morning. They put 1,000 houses in 3 years, so approximately 1,000 houses. These are private houses with some affordability measure somewhere in them. And you definitely won't be able to read this, but basically, if you look at what's been built in these houses, they're 4-bedroom and 5-bedroom houses, and the example I'm giving is from an area that had some direct state providers involved. The average house is around $950,000 to $1.2 million. These are on the periphery, they're a good bit out from the centre of the city. The only affordable I could find in this area was a 1-bedroom apartment for $600,000. So that's below the kind of cut-off for affordable housing, but it raises issue of the value of $1 per square metre. So you can get a 3-bedroom house for $800,000, but you're paying $600,000 for a 1-bedroom. And this is an urban development right out on the periphery of the city. So in terms of what's happening in terms of affordable housing, and the government has been pushing housing output. That is the answer to affordability. Whatever we produce, it will eventually filter down and create affordable housing. The affordable component is questionable whether it is affordable, is only affordable in its first sale, and there's no idea of retention of affordable. There's ongoing problems with negotiation with developers. Are they going to produce more houses? And there are potentially possible delays. So what we've had is some of the developers have got the consents, they've got to provide affordable housing, but now after 3 years, the new planning regime is just about to be allowed in. Like now they can compare past consent with the new consenting process. The new consenting process doesn't require them to have an affordable component. So now they're considering, well, let's drop out of the system and do it under the new system. So there's possible continuing ongoing problems with this. I won't go through this in detail, but there's a lot of broader issues. There's a consensus that if we build houses, they'll become cheaper. but arguably that's a political construct, and I'm happy to discuss that later. The accords have both coercion and cooperation. It's unclear how that will unfold going forward. The emphasis on supply diverts attention from a whole range of other drivers of affordability, including demand, mortgage markets, dynamics, housing, wealth inequality. And the drive for the new housing supply has implications for urban sustainability and livability issues. I want to turn now to the social housing sector. Again, this social housing reforms came out in 2013, and this is probably where people will start, it'll resonate, bells will start ringing in the room. I'm going to look at a little bit about the conceptual and empirical background, the genesis of the reforms, and the nature of the reforms. I'll do it really quickly. Happy to answer questions at the end. So, since the 1930s, the central government has been the main provider of social housing in New Zealand. Housing New Zealand has over 60,000 houses and dwellings and houses over 180,000 people. Local authorities, 15,000 units, and community housing providers, 5,000. So New Zealand's been subject to some of the significant change that are happening in welfare systems globally, and what we've seen is at one level, a shift in the welfare state dynamics towards residualisation and marginalisation. I'm sure you're all aware of these terms. But also an increasing openness to international policy transfer. So there's always a path dependency in social housing, so what we've been doing and how we go forward. But New Zealand's also this kind of, let's have a look for best practice and let's import it from overseas. In terms of the specifics of New Zealand, I've identified three historic phases. The 1990s, you've got your radical neoliberal policies, introduction of market rents in the social sector. So kind of market rents, very unusual to have a social sector which is usually characterised by below market rents, but in New Zealand it was market rents you introduced. By 2000, that was seen to be problematic. New government came into power, Labour. They reintroduced income-related rents, but then they had people in the sector who were paying market rents, so they didn't know what to do with them, so they kind of left them there. So there's kind of a hybrid, market rents and income-related rents. And then more recently, I've termed this the Stealthy Revelation. Post-2010. Nobody talks about it, but it's quite significant changes. So in 2010, the government created a housing stakeholders advisory group to advise on the most efficient and effective policies, how to be more productive and innovative, and how to be transparent. And probably at the time, most people in the housing sector saw this as a way of privatising housing in New Zealand or getting rid of it or selling it in some way. But the group that they established, HSAG, produced a report in which they envisaged a kind of a much more dynamic, multiple provider sector for social housing in New Zealand. And they argued that these groups would work together to ensure that every New Zealander has decent, affordable housing. There's a future where help for people with the highest level of need goes hands in hand with opportunity for those who are ready to move on. There's a future in which all providers of social housing play to their natural strengths, concentrating on the core activities that they do best. And in a sense, this was a voice of the community housing sector being inserted in a process which had kind of alienated them or sidelined them in the past. Now, what happens when you do that, when you, in New Zealand, is, be careful, they inserted their voice, but in a process which we can term lost in translation. The government then takes that advice and then constructs it in some way. So what's really happened is they picked up on this notion of social housing being residual and transitory in nature, and they've also picked up the need for maybe creating a larger role for community housing providers. So in 2013 they introduced a set of reforms. The reforms include key legislation. The legislation allows for switched the allocation of housing from Housing New Zealand as a key provider. Now housing is provided by the Ministry of Social Development. So now Housing New Zealand does not choose its tenants. As ministry chooses the tenants. Secondly, it introduced reviewable tenancies. I'll explore that in a few minutes. And then it expanded income-related rent subsidy, which was only the preserve of Housing New Zealand, to all community housing providers, or at least you could tender and to receive the income-related rent subsidy. They've also proceeded to develop a policy towards stock transfer to expand the third sector. So I'll explore some of those in a little bit of detail. Reviewable tenancies. So if you remember, the sector since 2000 had people who were paying market rents and some paying income-related rents. So the MSD said what they were doing in introducing the reviewable tenancies was to shift expectations away from a social house for life to one for the duration of housing need, and to ensure housing is provided to those with the highest need. Now, the implications of this was clearly a strong attack on the notion of security of tenure for some of the groups that are most marginalised in New Zealand. Moreover, what it did was created the notion that social rented housing was actually to be an ambulance service. And this Hal has picked up with this issue in the Australian context. And what it did was it opened up all tenants to a review process by MSD, and approximately to date 3,000 reviews have been undertaken, initially focused on those paying market rents, but now reviewed to all tenants. So those 3,000 reviews, as of September, 788 people have been moved on. The overwhelming majority of those have been moved into private rental sector. Now, this is an issue not just for Housing New Zealand. It actually raises an issue for community housing providers that would take an income-related rent subsidy. So if you're taking an income-related rent subsidy, your tenant is chosen by MSD. They're also reviewed by MSD, and depending on whether you're also engaged in stock transfer, where you got your stock from, there are issues about whether you could retain somebody if MSD decided that they were to no longer get that subsidy. So there's some issues coming up. Funding via income-related rent subsidies. Now MSD makes an allocation, tells how many income-related subsidies it's going to provide, and you can bid for some of those. And so it's expanded beyond Housing New Zealand. Housing New Zealand being protected, it will get income-related rent subsidies, but now it's looking for more from the community housing sector. And this is meant to fund you to go out and get debt and equity capital. So the income-related rent represents kind of a new form of tenant governance system for the community housing providers as well. In a sense, MSD have a greater role over the choosing and also the longevity of that tenancy. Also, the government envisage community housing providers having definitely a corporate governance structure, and this comes out when we talk about stock transfer. So there's no, unlike the HSAG report, which argued for capital grants to grow the sector and some capital for funding, the initial view of the government is that if we give you a stream of income, you should be able to get money to look after all of these old stock that we're going to give you, and you should be able to maintain it through your rental income. So this is causing a bit of issues for the sector. So the third element of it was stock transfer. There are two components. One is urban regeneration and social mixing, and you're very familiar with that in the Australian context. The biggest stock transfer that's taken place was this year. 2,800 tenancies were transferred to the Tamaki Regeneration Company in Auckland. Tamaki is a suburb of Auckland. It's to the east of the CBD, 15 minutes into the CBD. It's 10 minutes from some inner city beaches. It's surrounded by some really nice housing in the private sector, but this has been traditionally a state housing area. Tamaki, by its numbers, 2,800 social houses in a total of 5,000 houses in the area. Over 70% Māori Pacific Island community. 17% unemployment rate compared to 8% for the city. High levels of hospital admissions and over 1 million per week spent on 3 benefits that are going into this community. So it's about changing this community and transforming the community. Tamaki Redevelopment is a company 51% owned by the Minister for Housing or Minister for Finance, and Auckland Council own 49%. So this redevelopment is driven by the usual requirements to create better outcomes for tenants, etc. But it also fits into going back to this producing more houses. There are about 140 hectares of Crown-owned land within this development, and it's expected that Tamaki Regeneration will produce an extra 7,000 houses, including affordable housing and private housing. So there's a huge concern within the community of whether this will produce a form of gentrification, given that this borders on some of the wealthier suburbs of Auckland. I'm happy to talk about that in a minute. Second element of stock transfer is trying to sell off stock to community housing providers and expanding the third sector. It was initially thought that the biggest groups that would enter this area would be the Salvation Army, but they withdrew from the process. They've attempted to sell houses in regional centres, Tauranga and Invercargill. Tauranga is on the east coast, Invercargill is on the South Island. The Invercargill one has fallen over, they couldn't get group to do it. Tauranga is in its last stages of negotiation. And according to the community housing providers, there's a real problem of lack of transparency. They're not sure what's going on in the bidding process within this and how the government is pricing its contribution to the sale process. So just in terms of what's happening in New Zealand, there's conflicting logic about what the government is doing within the social rented sector. At one level, it's talking about an ambulance service only providing for a period of time when you need that housing, and that fits into the social investment kind of model, but also creating the context for an aspirational community within social mix, that in fact, if you do well, you might actually be pushed out of the community. So there are some issues that are being grappled with. The second one is that it's a financially complex process about the stock transfers. Up until at least September, and now there's kind of a change, but there's been some changes, but there were no capital grants for maintenance. CHPs were required to rely solely on debt and equity financing driven by your access to an income-related rent subsidy. In terms of the stock transfer, from what I can gather from what the Treasury have released, and there's a lot of secrecy around this. They say they will produce the information after the first sale has gone through, but because this is a real estate transaction, they say it's subject to privacy issues. But the government subsidy represents some kind of below market price. When they say below market, it's below market if that house was rented as a going private concern rather than a low income concern. And then, so there's some kind of subsidy, but you have to bid for it in a tender process. So there is a private driver of this process. So in terms of the reforms, there's been significant reforms, refashioning the administration of the sector and the financing of social housing. It aligns with a wider project of kind of the social investment model for the welfare sector in New Zealand. It has significant implications for the tenants, but also for the character of community housing providers as they develop. Broader reflections to just finish off. The housing supply is the mantra that the national government have emphasised. It's been put at the centre of housing affordability issues. It's been raised here a couple of times. I think that answer of supply, and they're just talking about any kind of supply, is problematic. I think supply is a necessary but not sufficient condition for affordability. In terms of the social housing reforms, there are impacts on tenants are unclear. It definitely fits into a social investment logic. I think there needs to be a follow-up of those 700 people who've been moved on. It'd be interesting to see how many of them return back into the sector in the coming years. But they've been moved on, so the kind of actuarial obligation has been shifted. But the question is, will they come back? The second one, and there's clearly the government pushing for supply of a very strong view that the Housing New Zealand has a lot of unused land, and so they're applying very much a development finance logic to using that land. So they want private housing developed in that land, but there's no guarantee that what affordable component will actually be affordable. They just want land that produces housing. Happy to talk about that in the questions. And the CHP role remains unclear. I talked to a leader of CHP sector on the phone the other day and asked, I said, I'm giving this presentation and I just want to know if you could give me some insights. And he said, well, I'd be happy if you could give me some insights. He said, I've been to Treasury 3 times. I've tried to explain my funding model 3 times, and they've explained their funding model to me 3 times. I still don't understand it. And he said, I've been in the business 20 odd years. I've worked across multiple sectors and multiple state organisations in the US and elsewhere. And he said, I still don't understand it. So clearly it's working for Treasury, but not necessarily for community housing providers. At least this person has indicated there's still problems. Thank you.